Hello, and welcome to the History of London. I'm Dr. Ian Stone, and today I'll be joined by Professor David Carpenter. David is a professor of medieval history at King's College London, and the author of several books on the Middle Ages. Two of his more famous publications include The Struggle for Mastery, which offers a history of Britain from 1066 to 1284, and Magna Carta. His latest book, published in the last month, is the first volume of his biography of King Henry III. Henry, who reigned from 1216 to 1272, was the fourth longest serving monarch ever to have sat on the throne of England. For those of us interested in the history of London, Henry is probably most famous for building Westminster Abbey. But, as we shall see, his reign was important for London in so many other ways. David's book has been described by reviewers as epic and a brilliant study, and we are very fortunate to have him with us to discuss Henry today. David, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Ian.
It's our pleasure, David. Let's be honest, Henry is not the best known of English medieval kings. Yet, as you point out at the start of your new book, no king of England came to the throne in a more desperate situation than Henry III. Could you introduce Henry and the world into which he was born, and then say more about the challenges which he faced and how he and his supporters overcame these?
Yeah, the immediate situation was actually dire because King John, his father, had rejected Magna Carta, and the barons had then offered the throne to the eldest son of the King of France, Prince Louis. And when John died in October 1216, Louis commanded the allegiance really of more than half, perhaps two-thirds of the great barons. He controlled London. And it looked for all the world as though John's 9-year-old son, Henry III's only 9, might be swept away. Perhaps he would have been packed off to a monastery and Louis would have become King of England. So that was the desperate situation in which Henry III came to the throne. In the end, it didn't work out like that. Henry's remaining supporters won the Civil War, established Henry on the throne. But Henry was then, I think, really a king in a new age after that. He was the first king who had to face the restrictions of Magna Carta, because one way his supporters won the war was to concede all the rebels had been fighting for. They conceded Magna Carta, which John had rejected, and Louis, in a way, was ignoring. So Henry's the first king of England who has to govern within those kinds of restrictions. In some ways, it was even more challenging than that, because Henry was also the first king of England who had to contend with the growing power of Parliament. Parliament first really appears by that name, but also as a powerful force in national life in Henry's reign. And so Henry has to deal with that. He's also in a new age spiritually and from the religious life of the country. The friars arrive in England in the 1220s. And also there's a tremendous movement, conscientious movement amongst many committed bishops to reform the lives of their flock, the people in their diocese, the clergy and people in their diocese, in line with the rules set out in the great papal council of 1215 called the Fourth Lateran Council. So Henry's very much someone within a new age having to deal with new challenges.
I think another way that he was a king in a new age as well, it's related to one of the more unsuccessful sides of his father's rule as well, is that John had lost his patronage of Normandy, hadn't he?
Yeah, no, you're quite right there too. So overshadowing the reign is the loss of the great continental possessions. Normandy, held since 1066. Anjou, held since 1154 by Henry's predecessors. They'd been conquered by Philip Augustus, the great king of France, in 12045, and that ripped the heart from the dynasty's continental empire. So Henry has to face that too. He is a king of greatly diminished power compared to his predecessors, and faces the question, is he ever going to actually recover those continental possessions?
I mean, listening to that, I can quite understand why you said that no King of England had yet come to the throne in a more desperate situation. So, how did Henry and his supporters overcome this? You've said something about Magna Carta, something with which we perhaps associate more with his father than we do with Henry. How else did they overcome these challenges in a very sort of...
Well, just a word about Magna Carta, because I think it was central to meeting those challenges, because what the minority government of Henry III did, as soon as he came to the throne...
When you say minority, Henry was a young...
So Henry's only 9 when he comes to the throne.
Right.
So really, the future of the dynasty is in the hands of a small group of loyalist barons, and also in the hands of a great papal legate called Guala. And because by this time the papacy is on King John and the dynasty's side. So what they did, I think, an extraordinary, courageous, but also perceptive, far-sighted decision was to think the only way to win this war is to concede what the rebels are fighting for. And so almost as soon as Henry came to the throne, the next month, November 1216, they issued a new version of Magna Carta. And I think that took the heart out of the rebellion. There still had to be military victories. There was a military victory at Lincoln in May 1217. But I think the most striking thing there is that the great English barons on the side of this French prince clearly didn't fight very hard. They sort of struck a token blow and then surrendered. And that was because they knew that what they were fighting for, Magna Carta, a new form of limited monarchy, had already been conceded. And so that's the essential reason the central force behind Henry establishing himself on the throne. Now, of course, he is not responsible for that. It's done by great ministers, William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, who's the regent. These are the people who've won the war for him, established him on his throne. But Henry lives with the consequences. And the final definitive version of Magna Carta, the Magna Carta, which is still on the statute book of the United Kingdom today, in some of its clauses, is not King John's Charter of 1215, but Henry's Charter of 1225, which he issues just towards the end of his minority. And so, Henry lives with that legacy.
The English barons who fought at Lincoln, and you said earlier that perhaps half of the country was against Henry as he came to the throne. I mean, how were they treated once peace had been restored?
Well, that's another very important factor in establishing Henry on the throne. Right. And if ever there was a civil war which ended in a statesman-like way, this was it, because the rebels were all returned to their estates. They weren't disinherited. That was partly because Louis had made very good, before he left for France, resigning his claim to the throne, had made very good terms with his supporters. But it's also, I think, thanks to the wisdom of the great magnates on Henry's side, that they saw the only way to smooth over the awful storms of the Civil War was in a very conciliatory settlement. So the settlement included a new version of Magna Carta and also the return of everyone to their lands as they held them before the war.
Yes, and for those of us that are particularly interested in the history of London, it's worth noting that some of Louis's greatest support came from the Londoners, but that the Londoners were very much...
You're absolutely right, Barry. And I mean, the great base of the rebellion of Louis and the rebel barons was London. And there too, London was spared punishment after the war. So Louis had got terms for the Londoners as well.
You said about the peace that was arranged after the Civil War being statesmanlike, and I do quite agree. I can't think of another civil war that ended on such good terms, if I can put it like that. But elsewhere in your book, you also speak about Henry's statesmanlike peace with the King of Scotland, particularly in 1238, when Henry renounces his claims of overlordship over the King of over the Scottish kingdom, and in return, the Scottish king Alexander, I believe, isn't it, gives up his claim to the northern counties of England, so Cumberland, Westmoreland, and North. I mean, you described that as a statesmanlike peace as well, and it seems that a constant theme throughout Henry's reign, and perhaps surprising, especially when compared to his son Edward, is very good relations with Scotland generally. I mean, there's the odd moment when things go a bit wobbly.
You're right about that, Ian. Can I put that in a wider context?
Please.
Because I think the greatest achievement of Henry in his reign was peace, internal peace, and that was also linked to external peace. So when we think of his external relations, he makes a very statesmanlike settlement with the King of Scotland, which you've just referred to, in which the King of Scotland resigned his claims to England's northern counties, and Henry, in return, basically gave up his claim to overlordship of Scotland. He didn't do so in so many words, but that was implicit in the 1238 settlement. And that laid the foundations. It consolidated this long, long period of Anglo-Scottish peace, which lasted, in fact, all the way through from 1217 to 1296. Now, Henry did wage wars in Wales, but they were really last resorts. And I think it's really extraordinary that in the 1240s, when he had the opportunity, and in a way, the justification, he didn't seek to conquer Wales in the same way as his son, Edward I, did. So I think his attitude to Wales and to the Welsh rulers was that he wanted to live in peace with them. And then the final great peace he made was with the King of France, Louis IX, in which in 1259, in the Treaty of Paris, wonderfully statesmanlike settlement, Henry resigned his claims to the lost territories, to Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou, but was accepted as Duke of Aquitaine, so he retained Gascony and additional territories Louis had conceded him. You see, and that too laid the foundations for a long, long period of nearly 25 years of Anglo-French peace as well. So in terms of external relations, Henry was a peacemaker. Now, also, there was internal peace, because essentially peace in England lasted from 1217, the end of the Magna Carta Civil War, all the way through to 1263. And I think Henry certainly took credit for that and was given credit for that. Contemporaries praised the long peace of his reign. And that had all sorts of consequences. It had consequences for London, because London hugely expanding in size in terms of population, prosperity, thanks to this long period of peace. There was it permitted the work of the friars, of bishops pastorally, reforming the lives of their diocese, all the great cathedrals built and rebuilt in Henry's reign. It also allowed a new commercial network of markets and fairs, and a huge increase in the money supply. Henry issued a recoinage in 1247, which was a tremendous success. And if I may say, Ian, that's one reason why, if you go online, you can buy Henry III silver pennies from the recoinage of 1247 very easily and comparatively cheaply, whereas coins from before that are very hard to come by.
I mean, I think you described the recoinage as a colossal administrative achievement or something like that.
Absolutely.
I mean, but Henry did. I mean, Henry did go on military campaign. I mean, again, against Louis of France, particularly in 1230 and 1242, 43, I think. And okay, we can say that Henry was let down by his allies, particularly on the second campaign. We can sort of, we can say that it was a very hard thing for him to seek to do, and all of those things. But they weren't the most successful military campaigns. Right?
No, well, you can say that again. They were abject failures.
Abject failures. Okay.
Henry did want to recover the lost lands in France, but he was a king with ambition in that area, but without the illness that should attend it. So he had absolutely no martial expertise. He was totally the reverse of Richard the Lionheart or his son Edward I. There's no evidence he ever attended tournaments. He hawked. He was a great hawksman, falconry, but had no reputation as a huntsman. So Henry just had no knowledge how to drive forward a military campaign. And that's why his two attempts to recover his lost territories in 1230 and 1242, as I've said, were abject failures. And I mean, after that, I mean, fundamentally, he was a king who needed to live in peace. And he was a Rex Pacificus. That's how he's described in contemporary sources, a Pacific king. And I think he was so wise in the end to realise that and make peace with Louis IX of France.
I mean, astonishing excursion, well, not excursion quite, but in 1254 when Henry's making his way back from Gascony and he arranges to meet Louis and they go through Paris together, and Louis presents him with the gift of the elephant, of course, following this. And Henry makes quite an impression, I think, it's fair to say, on Louis's subjects. You know, we think about an entente cordiale or something perhaps in the modern era, but when we consider how difficult relations had been between the Capetians, the kings of France, and the kings of England, this was unheard of, wasn't it? For a conquest, I think.
I wish in these Brexit days we could think of that a little bit more and think of the necessary ingredients for negotiating a successful peace. And underlying the Peace of Paris in 1259 with a very, very close relationship between Louis and Henry.
Who were rivals.
They started off as rivals and then they became friends. And as you say, they were married to sisters. And I think they also respected each other in many ways. They respected each other's piety. They were both deeply religious kings. And in Paris, I mean, Henry held these huge feasts in which he fed large numbers of paupers. He gave gifts to everybody, and he was widely admired for his conduct in Paris. But out of that, I think this very deep personal bond between Henry and Louis, but also between the two sisters, Queens Eleanor and Queen Margaret, developed. And I mean, it's just a wonderful thing in a way. One thinks so often of kings and rulers, prime ministers, presidents in all ages having, very, very difficult relationships. This was quite the reverse of it. And if it hadn't been for that, this very close relationship between Henry and Louis, there would certainly be no Peace of Paris in 1259. And what was so good was that the legacy of the peace then lasted into the next generation and saw peace between England and France lasting all the way through, as I've said, to 1294.
You mentioned Henry's wife, Eleanor, here. Perhaps we should introduce her. Could you say something about Eleanor?
Well, Henry was very, I mean, in a sense, going back to Henry's peace, why was there internal peace? It was because Henry was very easygoing. He was affable, gregarious, warm-hearted, lazy. And
he never saw Carlisle.
No, he never saw Carlisle. And he spent one of the fascinating things about Henry is that we know where he was on nearly every day of his reign. That's because of this unique source. I am coming back to Queen Eleanor.
No.
I haven't quite lost my way. But we have in Henry's reign this wonderful, unique source, which are all his letters, and they're enrolled on the rolls of the Chancery. And unlike any other king, they are very personal letters. Later in the Middle Ages, the Chancery letters become very formulaic. They're not personal. In Henry's reign, and it's the first reign where these rolls survive in toto, while they've got lots of letters which are purely bureaucratic and the king has nothing to do with them, they also have lots and lots of very personal letters of the king. What these letters do, they all end with a date and place of issue. And so they show where Henry was on nearly every day of the year. And what they show is he'd had this wonderfully comfortable life, this comfortable itinerary, where he spends weeks and months at his favourite palaces and palace castles, all in the south, Westminster, Winchester, Windsor, Marlborough. The furthest north was Woodstock. Now, how does this all come back to Henry's queen? Well, Henry married in 1236 Eleanor of Provence, and she was only 12. She's not a great heiress. She doesn't bring very much with her. In fact, sorry I didn't make more of that in the book. But Henry loves her. Warm-hearted, open-handed. He showers her with gifts, rewards, clothes, jewels, and so on. And he gives her the space in which to operate, this indulgent husband. And she made use of that space because as the years went on, it was clear that she was a much tougher character than her husband. She becomes a faction fighter in the politics of Henry's reign. She vigorously promotes the interests of her uncles who come from Savoy. She quarrels bitterly with the second group of foreigners Henry introduced in England, his half-brothers from Poitou. And she actually plays a very major part in the Revolution of 1258. And then in the Civil War. So she plays a bigger part. I think you could argue that Eleanor of Provence plays a bigger part in English political life than any queen since the conquest.
Yes, I mean the only person who perhaps would come close, I think, would be Eleanor of Aquitaine. But she was famously locked up there as well, wasn't she? For such a long period.
Henry got cross with her on one or two occasions, but at least she was never locked up. She was exiled. She went to France in the Civil War when she tried to raise an army to rescue her husband in a very impressive way. She was a very impressive woman.
I somehow imagine she was cross with Henry more often than he was cross with her.
I think she was exasperated by it, but I think she also knew, in a way, she was on a winner. I mean, she knew how really to control him for a lot of the time, and she knew that he was open-handed. I mean, one of her clerks, John of Howden, wrote a wonderful poem after Henry's death, in which what's the characteristic he singles out for Henry? He singles out the way he gives like a flowing fountain. And Eleanor knew that, and knew that she was, in a way, as I've said, onto a good thing.
This warm-heartedness of Henry to which you refer, I mean, we shouldn't really be sort of simplistic as to say either a good thing or a bad thing, but we can see that I think both the pluses and the minuses of on one hand, he's feeding 500 paupers a day, which, as you point out, is a substantial sum of money over the course of 10 years, perhaps enough to build a castle.
And don't forget that, of course, on great occasions, like the feast of his patron Saint Edward the Confessor, the numbers go up into thousands. And when his favourite sister, the Empress, died, he wanted to feed 100,000 paupers.
It's a wonderful expression of royal piety and charity here. His patronage towards the foreign relatives that you've mentioned, the Savoyards and his half brothers from Poitou, called the Lusignans, often. I mean, it can be seen as part of a very strategic way of thinking, if you like, Henry, trying to build these diplomatic networks across Europe, bringing people in that are extremely capable or very well connected. So shouldn't necessarily be criticised per se for this open-handedness. And of course, kings were meant to be generous. Kings were meant to reward their followers in the Middle Ages.
Sure. I think there were good reasons for having connections with both his wife's uncles, the Savoyards, because they gave Henry an entirely new international profile, all kinds of connections. There were reasons too for giving patronage to his half brothers, because they still had substantial interests in Poitou, and that might help the defence of Gascony. And also Henry thought both groups are going to be very loyal to me. I don't think it was a question of him distrusting the native nobility, but he certainly thought, well, these are family. If I establish them in England, they will be loyal there too, and sort of pillars of the regime. I think he thought the same of Simon de Montfort. The trouble is that those perfectly reasonable ambitions were marred by just going over the top and not knowing when to stop. And, if he had given patronage to these people in a judicious way, if he'd known when to say no as well as yes, I think it could have worked out. But I mean, he just went, he did extraordinary things. Like, for example, he established Peter of Savoy, the Queen's uncle, as Lord of Richmond in Yorkshire, as far as one can see, without ever having met him. He likewise made the younger brother, Boniface, Archbishop of Canterbury, without ever having met him. And the degree of favour he channeled to these people just went beyond the bounds of sense. And also, he lacked the political skill really to reconcile the factional conflicts which resulted. I think Henry's idea was that there would be a harmonious court in which native magnates would intermarry with his foreign relatives, but he just lacked the political skill to bring that about. And there was a wider problem, because this is a period of growing English national feeling. Since the loss of Normandy in 1204, all the great barons now only had land in England. They were born in England. And so they can join with the general bulk of the population in the feeling of Englishness. And so Henry seems, although he's the most English king in a way since the conquest, because he basically lives in England.
And he's patron of the Confessor as well.
Yeah, he seems grievously at odds with the Englishness of his subjects. So in a way, we're coming round to understanding why there was a revolution in 1258. Henry had done good things. He wasn't a hard-driving, spiky, unpleasant king like King John. He'd made peace. He'd been indulgent to great English magnates as well as his foreign relatives. And I think one thing which has emerged, what important new piece of research is the extraordinary contrast between Henry's rule and John's rule in terms of offerings of money to the king for concessions and favours. Under John, it was quite regular for the king to be offered £25,000 a year for all kinds of concessions. Under Henry, the figure was about sort of £5,000. And that reflected, I think, a decline in the king's ability to extract money from his subjects by arbitrary means. It reflected, in a way, both the letter and the spirit of Magna Carta. So in all these ways, Henry fits perfectly into post-Magna Carta kingship. And that does explain why there is this long period of peace. But of course, the trouble was, on the other side, he creates a factionalized court in which there are awful quarrels over patronage policy between foreign relatives, English magnates, all in that sort of pot together. And at the same time, and this is, I think, one of the great problems of Henry's reign, is that Henry had totally failed to reform the realm. And I think the reason for that is almost the other side of his piety. I think Henry was very sure of his, in a sense, in his place in heaven. Here was a king devoted to Edward the Confessor, feeding hundreds, thousands of paupers, a good and pious king trying to convert the Jews to Christianity. And I think Henry's confessors probably said, you've nothing to worry about. Your conscience should be clear. Instead, he should have been thinking all the time about, okay, I've also got a responsibility to the wider realm to root out oppression, malpractice, especially of local officials. And he quite failed to do that, partly because he's thinking of other things, but partly perhaps because his very piety took his mind off that. And here he was very different from his contemporary King of France, Louis IX, who saw as integral to his kingship and integral to his own salvation the rooting out of corruption in the realm. he needed to reform France to save his soul. And that was just not a vision which Henry had. And so what happened in 1258 was a combination of a court coup, all the factional fighting overspilling to one group of magnates and foreigners rounding on another, linked to this discontent more widely in the realm at the failure to reform the realm, and also a madcap scheme Henry had to place his second son on the throne of Sicily.
Yes, I think you refer to that as perhaps the most ridiculous agreement ever entered into by an English monarch.
Yeah, and I suppose this comes back to perhaps one word we haven't yet talked about, but which runs through some of the things I've said, is what characteristic did people single out for Henry, contemporaries? It was his simplicity. One of the best character descriptions of him was that he was a pious king, a rex piissimus, but also a rex simplex. Now, simplex is a very difficult word quite to get right. It can be praise. It means honest, straightforward, like the prophet Job was described as simplex. And Henry sometimes called simplex in that way, but he was also simplex in, well, simplex can mean you're just plain foolish, stupid, thick. Perhaps that's unfair, but I think with Henry it meant he was naive. Yeah. And that takes us back to just not having the political skills to reconcile factions at court, to know when to stop in his open-handed giving. And the simplicity came back most terribly in this extraordinary scheme to place his second son on the throne of Sicily. Now, that was an offer made to him by the Pope in 1253-45, and Henry thought, oh, this is just wonderful. Coming from the Pope, it must be a gift from God. What he failed to realise is that the Pope was actually, on the one hand, saying, well, OK, I'm offering you this kingdom of Sicily. The first thing you've got to do is to pay me nearly £90,000 for the privilege of the offer. And then, having paid that money, you've got to actually take an army all the way out to Sicily to conquer it from its ruler, who's called Manfred, a illegitimate son of the Empress Frederick II. Well, I mean, of course, it was completely impossible. There was no way Henry could raise the money in the first place. And there was equally no way he could possibly take an army out to Sicily. I mean, the whole of the English establishment, the church, Parliament, were appalled by the whole scheme. So, how on earth could Henry think of doing that? And here again, it's his simplicity and his piety, because he actually said to the Pope, look, everyone tells me this is impossible. I can't do it. But then Henry goes on in this letter to say, about trusting in the Almighty who can quell tempests and move mountains, I'm going to go ahead anyway. And having gone ahead, he then makes this offering at the shrine of Edward the Confessor, that the Confessor will have a happy outcome. We haven't talked about the Confessor. Perhaps we ought to do that.
No, I think we should, yeah. I will come back to the Confessor. I'm just thinking about Sicily. I mean, at one point in the book, you speak about how just a dangerous gulf opened up between Henry and his subjects. And I think, we see that clearly in the Sicilian affair, the Sicilian business, where the king's sights are set on a much higher plane, if you like, than the majority of his subjects. But going back to something you said earlier as well about the sort of, there's a real sense in your book of how Henry's court and Henry himself drifted away from the political nation, if I can put it in those terms. There's a very wide political community in 13th century England, isn't there? And many of them do not feel they're getting the access to the king and to royal justice in the way that they would have perhaps liked. And I think there's another example there of perhaps comparing Henry to Louis, or thinking about how Henry could have reformed the realm. An awful lot of people felt that the court was just too remote, didn't they?
I think that's right. I think that, and that remoteness goes to some institutional changes. Henry no longer had a chancellor. He no longer had a chief justiciar. And these are people who you could address complaints too. And I think the court therefore becomes increasingly remote from the political community. And you're so right to say the political community is increasing in size during this period. Knights, free tenants, peasants are becoming much more vocal. And Henry, I think, just didn't grasp that. I think, again, he probably thinks my piety is enough. And people should see that I'm a good and pious king. I'm devoted to a patron saint, Edward the Confessor, which I'm giving to the realm. I'm rebuilding Westminster Abbey. I'm doing all these things. That, for Henry, seemed enough. And he just doesn't grasp, sometimes with words, but never with deeds, that it's not enough. And he needs to reach out to a wider community.
Should we say something about the Confessor then? Because, again, probably not the most well-known, the most famous medieval monarch, but groundbreaking in so many ways. I mean, he's the last proper English king of the Anglo-Saxon line, I suppose, because as far as William the Conqueror and his descendants were concerned, Harold was a usurper. And then Henry adopts him as his patron saint, if you like. He names his eldest son after him. You said about Henry's creation of peace, both internally and externally, being perhaps his greatest achievement, but we could easily argue that Westminster Abbey was as well, in some ways. A sort of extraordinary divergence from his predecessors. Can you say more about the Confessor and Henry's devotion to him?
Yeah, well, you're so right. This was something entirely new. I mean, no previous king had a patron saint at all, let alone a patron saint in Edward the Confessor. And Henry doesn't inherit any confessorial cult patronized by any of his predecessors. In actual fact, it wasn't until quite into his 20s, in the mid-1230s, that all this changes. So, well, who's the Confessor? He was the last Anglo-Saxon king of the true line. He died on the 5th of January 1066 and was buried in the abbey he had built at Westminster. And that's all depicted on the biotapestry, with his body processing to this great new church he'd built. Well, the monks of Westminster desperately wanted to have a saint, and there was some merit in the Confessor. So in 1161, they find their campaign came to fruition, and the Confessor was made a saint, and he was translated to his new shrine in the Abbey in 1163. It was all a bit of a flop, actually. As I've said, no kings seem after that, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, John, none of them particularly devoted to the Confessor, or anyone else either. So how on earth does all this change in the mid-1230s and make Henry really a very unique king? I think it was a combination of two things coming together. The first was that Henry was just emerging from one of the most torrid times in his reign, 1232, 1234. He'd fallen under the spell of a great minister, the Bishop of Winchester, Peace de Roche, who'd driven him for the only time in his reign into the kind of rule that John had espoused. And so Henry was accused of tyranny. He was even threatened with deposition. There was a civil war in Wales. There was disorder in England. And so in the end, Henry's forced to dismiss the bishop, and he feels grievously let down by his great ministers. So it's at this very point that the monks of Westminster get hold of him, because the monks of Westminster are desperate to have the king's support. They're trying to rebuild the abbey, and they haven't made much progress. They're desperate to defend their privileges against the demands of the king's judges. And so they come to Henry and they say, basically, look, your temporal ministers have let you down. Place your trust in an eternal minister who will always be there and always see you right. And that's the Confessor. And I think there was one crucial clinching thing, and that's Henry's desperate to get married. And one of the monks of Westminster, it was the Prior of Hurley, Richard le Gros, was one of the leading diplomats in negotiating the marriage with Eleanor of Provence. And he comes back and he says, look, who has got you this wonderful wife? It's, of course, the confessor. You placed your trust in the confessor, and it's worked. And from then onwards, Henry was hooked, and devotion to the confessor becomes absolutely central to his life. And I think it works in two ways. At first, it's very personal. I mean, Henry thinks, if I show my devotion to the confessor, he will see me right in this life. He will intercede at God's right hand and help me in all my aims and ambitions in this life. But of course, even more important, he will get me to the next. He will get me to heaven. So that's the very personal side of it. But I think there was also more to it than that, in that Henry is also offering the confessor to the nation. He's saying he is now going to be our national saint. I want everybody to participate in all the great goods the confessor can bring. Everyone must show their devotion to him. They must thank me for it, but also, they must, in two ways, they must think, well, I'm a king supported by the confessor, but they must also want to thank me for giving them the confessor. And of course, at the centre of that giving was Westminster Abbey, because you have to understand, how does sanctity work? If you've adopted someone as your patron saint, the absolutely vital thing is to persuade that saint that you are indeed devoted to him. No good just going around saying, you're my patron saint. Then the saint will come back and say, oh yes, show it. So Henry thinks, how can I show it? How can I prove to the confessor that I'm absolutely devoted to him? And the answer is Westminster Abbey. Now, you might think that was a bit odd, because what Henry thinks is, I'm going to rebuild Westminster Abbey in the most modern way possible, make it the most splendid church in the world, to prove to the confessor my devotion to him. But of course, that involved pulling down the church the confessor had built. And
which was an impressive church.
That the confessor would be somewhat miffed at the destruction of his own structure. But Henry obviously didn't think of it like that. He thought, oh no, the confessor is going to be tremendously pleased that I am putting down his church, which was certainly very old and out of date, and the Pope described it as ruinous, and I'm going to build this wonderful new church in its place, and also provide the confessor with a new shrine. So that's what the Henry did. But you see, here again, the two objectives come in. He's doing it for himself, but also doing it for everyone, for the public, because of course you've got to think, where is the Abbey? It's at the very centre of the realm. It's at Westminster, beside the royal palace, where the Exchequer, the Court of Common Pleas meet. And once Henry started to get the Abbey going in 1245 and building it, he also times the confessor's feast day on the 13th of October with the opening of Parliament. So clearly Henry's thinking, what's going to happen here? People are going to attend Parliament, attend the feast day of the confessor on 13th of October, see this wonderful new church I'm building, and then open Parliament and fall in with my wishes. So it's personal, it's very political, and it's very, very London, very London. And you've got to think of looking over London. If you looked over London from, say, the hill of Hampstead or Blackheath or Brockley, 1240s, 50s, of course, still dominating is the great spire of St. Paul's. But then over at Westminster, you see the great hulk of this amazing new church going up. And I think it's terribly important to realise that the Abbey was a church like nothing else seen in England. If you compare it to some of the contemporary English churches, to Salisbury particularly, which was all built in Henry's reign, the Abbey is dramatically different and far more spectacular and splendid. People had never seen a church like that in England, and that's partly because of its great internal height. It's 104 feet from the floor to the top of the vault, which 20, 30 feet higher than many of the great contemporary English cathedrals. It's partly because of its wonderful form of its windows with the lancets and the roses above, And then, of course, the great rose windows in the south transept and the north transept facades, and the huge great north door, the main entrance. So why was all this new? It all came from France. I mean, the great master mason who designed the abbey with Henry, and I think Henry and the master mason worked closely together. It's called Henry of Rheims, and certainly came from the great cathedral. He may well have been an Englishman who'd worked there, but lots of the features I've just said came from the great French cathedrals, from Rheims, from Amiens, from Notre Dame in Paris. And people in England hadn't seen anything like them before. It's perfectly true, of course, that if a French architect had come and looked at the abbey, they might have said, well, yeah, all right, all very well. But actually, our cathedral's a lot higher. And
unlike the French to take to feel they're superior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think Henry would have had a reply to that. He would have said, yeah, they may be higher, but the abbey is far more magnificent in terms of its internal decoration. And that's true too. I mean, and that was hugely costly, which is it's the use of Purbeck marble, the use of sculpture, what's called diapa, these little roses, which are everywhere in the structure, the very deep mouldings, the carvings. All of that meant the abbey was far richer church than anything in France. And there was also one other thing, which actually relates very much to London today, and that one of the most exciting things done for London and done for the abbey over the last 10 years has been opening up at Westminster Abbey what are called the Queen's Galleries. Now, that's where the Queen opened them. That's why they're called the Queen's Jubilee Galleries. And that's where now all the Abbey's treasures are housed. Well, what are these Queen's Galleries? They're the central middle part, if you like, of the structure of Henry III's church. It's called the Triforium. And it's a galleried triforium with external windows, a roof and external windows. So it creates a huge amount of middle space in the church, a whole second story in the church where people can go. And they've never been open to the public before, and they are now open to the public. The question is, why did Henry want them? Why did he go for this galleried triforium, which huge extra expense, and also just not found in contemporary churches? You don't find it at Salisbury. You don't find it in the great French cathedrals. Why did Henry do that? I think there were two reasons. The first was that it was just made the church much more magnificent, grander, more spectacular. But secondly, and this goes back to Henry's piety, his feeding of paupers, what I think happened is that on the great feast days, all the paupers went up there to attend the great services before they then came down and were rewarded with their free meal. So we know for a fact from a record that on the 13th of October 1260, the feast of Edward the Confessor in that year, Henry fed 5,016 paupers. Well, I bet you before they had their meal, they were all up in the galleried triforium taking part in the service. And of course, it wasn't just the Confessor's feast. I mean, Henry's very aware that the Abbey, and I should have stressed this, is of course the coronation church of the kingdom, which again makes it so central. And I think Henry thought at coronations too, that's where the crowds will be. And of course, that's where they do go. They were there in the last coronation in 1953 and in previous coronations before that. So I think, in a way, that's something I suggested, I think, for the first time in the book, that this helps to explain this magnificent feature of the Abbey, Henry's piety, the desire for paupers to attend the services, helps to explain it. And you make
that sound almost as if that was Henry's idea, and I do wonder when you say about this abbey, how much of it do you think? And I suppose it's very hard for us to know, but how much of this was Henry working with Henry of Rheims and saying, "I like this. I would like you to do that. I've seen something I want you to do." Do we know that?
I think that's absolutely how it was, and we certainly have documentary evidence from these wonderful letters I've been talking about before, to show Henry's tremendous eye for architectural and decorative detail. For example, there's one order in which he says, I've just been told that it will be much more sumptuous if underneath my throne in the great hall in my palace of Westminster, the lions supporting the throne are made of bronze rather than of marble. And so I want them made in bronze. There's also very clear evidence that Henry was very much in tune with what's sometimes called the new expressivity in English art, the way in which particularly faces in sculpture and painting now express a much more lifelike and express naturalistic, express emotion. For example, he says, I want the painting of winter above a fireplace, in fact, the Queen's fireplace in the Palace of Westminster, by its sad looks, and it's obviously a figure representing winter, by its sad looks and miserable portrayals of the body, to be justly likened to winter. And then on the other hand, when he wants to have a painting in the church at the Tower of London, in which he wants some cherubims painted, little children, and he wants them to be joyful and cheerful in their expression. And of course, beyond that, there's a huge range of letters making very, very detailed orders for the decoration of copes, vestments, for paintings, architectural detail. So I think it's absolutely no doubt at all that what Master Henry would have done was to lay out plans for Henry to look at, and then to discuss with him in detail, what form of windows do you want? This is what you could have at Reims. This is what there is at Amiens. How do you want the north transept to look like? Do you want to cover the whole of the abbey in this amazing little square formalized roses called diaper? I think I almost imagine how that happened. I think Henry would have said to Master Henry, well, can we go one step further? How can we make the abbey even more a feast decoratively? And so Master Henry scratches his head and thinks, oh, well, why don't we cover every surface in diaper? And Henry says, go for it. That's what we'll do.
And I mean, he did.
I honestly think that's how it worked. I think essentially Master Henry of Reims and Henry III were together the designers of the abbey.
In some ways, an ideal patron, I suppose, rather than somebody sort of pursing their lips and saying, "Oh well, I'm not sure I've got the budget for that." Henry was not afraid to go for it. I mean, perhaps £50,000.
No, well, of course,
spent on the
absolutely. I mean, Henry drives on the work, and again, we can see that from his letters. He said, "I want all the marble work put up before winter. I'm very worried that the workmen are going to depart for lack of pay. Find the money wherever you can get it from." He's driving on the work all the time in an open-handed way. So he must have been a wonderful patron, because the same open-handed generosity, which was fatal in giving far too much patronage to foreign relatives, magnates, ministers, is absolutely wonderful as a patron of art and architecture. This is government funding without any kind of limits. And of course, that's where we know the cost. I mean, it was all paid for by Henry, basically out of the kingdom's revenues, and the cost was probably £40,000 to £50,000. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's over 1 year's annual revenue of the king and kingdom, and it would have been enough to have built at least 4 of the great grim castles with which Edward I finally held down the conquest of Wales, cemented the conquest of Wales. Well, I think Henry's money was far better spent.
Yeah, I think in the history of the King's works, they refer to Edward's castle building programme as being the equivalent of a sort of modern day buying a fleet of nuclear submarines. So, Henry,
absolutely.
Half a fleet of nuclear submarines or something, perhaps. But we'll just come back to perhaps one thing, and we might want to sort of think about just starting to come to a conclusion here is, You've mentioned Westminster and London, but of course, nowadays we very much think that Westminster is at the heart of London. But during Henry's reign in the 13th century, there were two distinct centres, Westminster and London, although they were kind of joined along the river. London, the city of London, had been founded by the Romans. It's on the site where now the financial centre, the city of London, the corporate sort of centre is. Westminster is about 4 miles up the river. It was a kind of centre of government. And Henry's relations with the Londoners could be fraught at times. Why was this? Why did Henry find it so difficult at times to get on with the citizens in the leading town in the country?
Yeah. The reason for that is partly due to taxation. Right. And that Henry was very determined to maintain his right to what he calls tallage London. Okay. That means that London is a royal town. All royal towns, like all royal manors, the king has this right to impose arbitrary taxation on them. He's wise not to do it very often, because if he does it too often, obviously, it will create political discontent. But the Londoners, on the other hand, argued exactly the reverse and argued that they were specially privileged and couldn't be tallaged. Now, that's a running area of dispute throughout Henry's reign. And essentially, Henry got his way, but it created lots of tensions with the leading aldermen, the citizens, and so on. And that's amazing. And of course, you're so right about the relationship between Westminster and London. And to take that a little bit further, I mean, Westminster with the Abbey and the Palace, they show the majesty of kingship. But of course, the Tower of London showed the might of kingship. Now, the Tower, of course, plays a very important role in Henry's relations with London, because you might think that, because Henry, this most pacific king, actually rebuilt the Tower in a major way and surrounded it with its inner circle of walls, which survive still. Why does he do that? You might think it was to be nice to London and protect London. Not a bit of it. No. It was to keep London under control. So much so that when the great new gateway Henry built collapsed, and more recent excavations have shown where it was, one Londoner had a vision of Thomas Becket, the most famous Londoner of all, coming to the walls and striking the new gateway with his pastoral staff. So it collapsed. And Becket was then quoted as saying that I am destroying these walls, this gateway, because it is here to oppress the Londoners, not to protect them. So the Tower of London was very important for the king's control over the city. I think it's probably right. One must be careful in exaggerating the tensions. I mean, there were periods when Henry's men were in control of London. He was obviously dependent on London for a lot of his food and drink and clothes and so on. And some of the great citizens were very, very closely connected with the court. But Ian, you know far more about this than I do. You should speak here. Am I right in thinking that taxation and tallage was the most important thing? I mean, it was also disputes over who should be mayor, who should be sheriff, and the king wanted his men in these kinds of places. But do you think taxation was the main problem?
I think taxation is definitely a major problem. I think the thing is, it's not always about the money. I mean, 1255, Henry turns round to Londoners and says, I want a tallage of 3,000 marks. And the Londoners say, well, we'll give you an aid of 2,000 marks. Yeah. And the dispute isn't over the 1,000 marks. The dispute is over status, if you like. Yeah. The difference between the king being able to say to the Londoners, you have to do this, and the Londoners saying, no, we will do this of our own free will.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right, that this is over money, but very closely connected with it is the status of Londoners. Can they be taxable? Or as Henry is quoted as saying, you are my serfs.
Ili rustici Londiniensi or something, isn't it? Yeah.
You know, so obviously the Londoners, on the other hand, think we're highly privileged. We're the leading citizens of the barons of London. You can't treat us like that. So it's certainly about status as well as money. The two are very closely connected.
And it goes back before Henry. This goes back to the reign of Richard, where the Londoners are forming a commune. It goes back to 1215 in the run-up to Magna Carta with John, where we see the Londoners, trying as hard as they can to get this thing about tallage into Magna Carta. So, I think it's I think it's a reflection of, one, the city of London's growing size and prosperity and importance in the realm, and as a consequence of that, as you say, Henry's very dependent on the Londoners to supply his wine and his luxury goods. And many of these leading Londoners become very, very rich indeed.
John Door, for example.
Yeah, these people they're as rich as many of the barons in the realm. And I think that they look and they think, well, hold on a second. We're as important as these people. We deserve to be treated in perhaps the same way that they do. And we get this extraordinary situation in 1250 where a very prominent Londoner, an alderman and a chronicler, Arnold Fitzstedmer, he makes his claim in his chronicle that the Londoners said that their peers were the earls and barons of England. I mean, it's an extraordinary sort of claim in many ways. And I think there's a broader power struggle perhaps here. And perhaps it crystallises around taxation. And it crystallises around Henry's patronage of Westminster. But I think, go on, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to agree with you. And I wish I'd put into the book that thing of Fitzstedmer. Fortunately, I have another chance because, of course, this is only volume 1. Volume 2 is the first chapter is going to be Henry and his people. And I think I shall have a sectional society, London there. And as soon as this conversation is finished, I have to make a whole series of notes as to what's going to be in that chapter. I'm going to remind myself of Fitzstedmer's statement in 1250. Just let me, rounding up, I mean, I think I probably ought to say a little bit about things like Henry's sense of humour, which I think partly creates this, I think, quite happy atmosphere at court. I mean, partly it's slapstick, so that when, for example, he went to Bath in the mid-1250s, he had his jester thrown in. And we know that because he then made a new suit of clothes, had a new suit of clothes made for him. So I think there's quite a lot of sort of push me, pull me, ragging people at court. But Henry's humour could also be slightly more sophisticated. There's a wonderful letter on the patent rolls in which he gives full power to one of his clerks, plena potestas. Now, normally you give full power in very sort of important situations, diplomat going to negotiate a peace treaty. But this is a letter giving full power to one of Henry's clerks to cut the hair, the long, long hair of all the other clerks. And then Henry says, and if you don't do so, I shall be forced to take the scissors myself to your own hair. And I think this must again reflect the sort of games at court, and you can imagine the king chasing round the clerks with a pair of scissors, trying to sort of cut their hair.
So different from his father. I mean, John had a sense of humour, but nothing like this.
Yeah, I mean, it was so different from John's spiky sense of humour, in which he tries to humiliate people, mock them. I don't think there was anything like that in Henry's court. One final story about him, which I think possibly may have some foundation, it's sort of in truth, and it's told by the Italian friar Salimbene, and he tells the story, which probably from the 1240s, in which there's another jester, and the jester, as jesters are supposed to be, can also be quite sort of provocative. So the jester said to Henry, well, O king, you are like Christ. And Henry was very pleased at this, but made the mistake of asking for more information. So the jester then said, well, you're like Christ because, like Christ, you're as wise at the age of 30 as you were when you were born. So Henry was very, very cross at this and ordered the jester to be hanged. But then the sequel is that which again shows really how Henry's temper goes down, how affable and easygoing really was most of the time. So the courtiers said to the jester, well, look, just make yourself scarce for a bit and come back when the king's anger has cooled down. It's interesting that this story, I think, that I suspect it got to Salimbene from a great friar who was at Henry's court for a while in the 1240s called John of Parma, who was a great friend of Salimbene. So I suspect it may be the sort of story going round which the jester sort of told, whether it actually happened. But it does capture, I think, Henry's, it's meant to illustrate Henry's simplicity, of course, but also his sort of sense of humour, his affability, ultimately. And so on. So I do think that of all the English medieval kings, Henry would have been the sort of nicest to have met. I think I can see him now welcoming you and me and to his court.
As he did with Matthew Paris,
Sorry?
As he did with Matthew Paris when he met Matthew Paris, and he made him work very well, didn't he?
He said, come and talk and come to dinner. He would have got up, perhaps given us a kiss of peace. And I think he would have been a very nice person to meet. I mean, obviously he had a very fierce temper, but it got cross quite easily. But that all calmed down. And for most of the time, I think he was affable and easygoing. But he did not have if you like, the intelligence. I think one of the reviews of my book said Henry was a bit thick. I think that's a bit unfair. I mean, he had a wonderful sense of beauty, of architectural detail. He was actually very interested in sort of detail of accounts and money and so on. But I think he was naive in not really being able to calculate how to get from A to B, what projects made sense, when to stop, when to say no. This sort of open-handed, very emotional personality was too easily exploited by unscrupulous magnates, foreign relations, magnates and ministers.
I mean, I think, I will just say this, but it can be so hard to get a real character sketch of people in the Middle Ages. I mean, we don't. I mean, just in a very physical sense, we don't actually have a true likeness of Henry. We don't
no,
quite.
I wish we. I wish we did. I sometimes go to bed at night wishing I could see him. Mind you, don't forget, his body must be perfectly preserved in his tomb in Westminster Abbey.
Yes.
And Dean Stanley in the 1870s was going to open it, but was unfortunately stopped, or I now think fortunately stopped by Queen Victoria, who said she was not amused at this scheme to tamper with the bones of her predecessor. So all he was able to do was to measure the coffin, which was 6'1.5". And so, as I suppose body length is less than coffin length, Henry was probably mid 5'5", 5'6".
Yeah, perhaps.
But obviously, his body must be perfectly preserved in that tomb. So if you opened it, you probably would you could see what he looked like. But I'm all against doing that, and I would.
We would
not like his bones to be disturbed.
We can't be too far off having technology that could see into the coffin without disturbing it, surely.
My only reservation there, Ian, is that having written a very learned article from documentary sources showing what all the vestments, the crown and the sceptre Henry was married with,
we don't want to challenge that, do we?
To do that in case I'm proved wrong. But no, actually, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? I wonder whether one could. I don't know. Can you sort of photograph through stone and everything?
I think I know ground penetrating radar. I mean, it's probably only a matter of time before we have the technology where we can get quite a detailed picture of what's there. But in terms of your book, one thing that really struck me, and it's particularly these two middle chapters on Henry's piety, Henry's court, is that we can build up a picture of Henry III and his court and his marriage and his relationship with his children. So much of what we've spoken about today has come from these record sources that Henry's government produced. And they're the letters of the king, as you said, whether they're these humorous kind of knockabout incidents with his clerks, or whether it's letters about the soft furnishings he wants somewhere. And I think many people would look at these records and think they are dry as dust letters of a bureaucracy. But when they're mined properly, we can really develop a picture of Henry and his court. And I absolutely did get a sense of the man in the biography. And I really enjoyed those middle two chapters, particularly, if I will say that. Of course, it's a first for the Yale English monarchs as well, because this doesn't cover all of Henry's life. It finishes in 1258, when there's this revolution that goes far beyond Magna Carta and its scope. And in fact, we probably don't see anything like it in this country again until the civil wars of the 17th century. Yeah. And I mean, at the start of 1258, the revolution really takes place in April and May 1258. And at the start of 1258, Henry has kind of settled scores with the Londoners, if you like, following this incident over Tallage in 1255.
Yeah.
He's moved against the Londoners. He's removed many of his opponents from political power in London. He's probably got good reason to feel quite satisfied at the end of February 1258.
I think actually the revolution of 1258 took Henry by surprise, precisely because he just had this triumph over the Londoners, helped him, I may say, by Richard de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, who he thought was on side and was not, and turned out he wasn't. So I think Henry was lulled into a false sense of security. And of course, he was completely taken by surprise by this march on the King's Hall, in which he feared he was actually, when confronted by the barons, that he was being made a prisoner. Whereas he might have retreated, if he'd only known it was going to happen, he could have retreated to the Tower of London and been completely safe. So, but Ian, that is another story. I think you should end this on your lovely little encomium about how close we can get to Henry, because I think that's so true. And I think those two chapters are the heart of the book, really. So
I think genuine biography there, genuine.
I do honestly think we can get. Obviously, one always thinks it about one's own king, but I do think that those record sources in particular, helped a little bit by Matthew Paris. I mean, we can get closer to Henry on a day-to-day basis than any other medieval king.
So, can I just ask one final? Do you know when we might expect this second volume? Because we do end on a cliffhanger at the end of this first volume.
Well, yes, I mean, given I hope to, I'm revising it now, and I hope to hand it into Yale next year. So it should come out in what's next year? 2021, 2022.
Okay, and will you come and speak to us when it does?
I would love to. I would be honoured to do so.
That would be fantastic. David, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ian.
We'll speak soon.
Yeah, okay.